science, technology, engineering, and math. What do they all have to do with storytelling, if you ask yourself? What if I tell you the answer to this question lies in sandwich? I mean, if you have been to Subway after your class or your work, you've taken away a roll of sandwich from Subway. But have you ever asked yourself, where did this word or this term sandwich come from? Well, in 1748, a British aristocrat by the name of John Montagu, he had a favorite pastime, and his favorite pastime was actually to play deck of cards with his group of friends. Later beknown to a lot of people was that he had a second pastime as well, which was to play cards and at the same time enjoy snacks, right? Who wouldn't? So he had a pet peeve because every time when he played cards, he had to use two hands. And when he does that, he could not enjoy his snacks. So what hadn't happened was that he decided to have one hand to play the card and have the other hand free to have a snack. And during one afternoon, he then asked one of his servants to prepare 2 slices of toast as well as a beef in between. Well, that then gave birth to the modern day sandwich. So had I not tell you about the story of sandwich, you probably will be thinking, where did it come from? Had I told you about the anatomy of sandwich, had I tell you about the science of sandwich, you'd be like looking at me plain dead. So this is the power of stories. Well, today I'm going to share with you why, after working with a lot of professionals in the STEM industry, whether they are entrepreneurs, scientists, PhD, whether they are policymakers, a lot of them struggle to do one thing, right? What do they struggle with is to bring the brilliance of their work out to the world. In fact, in working with a lot of them, all I know is that they are deeply brilliant with a genuine heart to help people. But the pity is, as you can see in the screen right now, there's always this what we call as a classic intent as well as impact gap, right? Intent is what they like to achieve. The impact is what they actually achieve. And if we could close this gap up, we get closer to their intended impact. So what does it take to close this gap? In my opinion as a coach, I believe that the pathway is what we do as a communication specialist, and the vehicle is storytelling. So in the usual cases when I work with clients, usually when there's a gap, what happens is a lot of their intended end users will say, huh? After listening to the pictures and presentation. But what does it take to go from huh to wow? And this is the heart of what I'm going to share today. I think in speaking with a lot of STEM professionals, one of the biggest pain points for them is that they tend to see their world as a very dichotomous, a very black and white view, right? Because if you look at science, science is rational, science is logical, science is grounded. But they feel that anything about storytelling is on the other side of the world. Well, science and storytelling belongs to the arts, right? Arts is creative, is dynamic, and is aspirational. So if you speak to a scientist or STEM professional about arts or storytelling, they'll be looking at you and say, Ben, stories belong in Disneyland. I am no Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. But actually, if deep down inside you ask them, they all have this secret yearning to be a Doctor Strange. But do they not realize that Doctor Strange is also a story well told? So for the longest time, I've sort of brought up this conundrum with them and trying to sort of reconcile that science actually thrives on sometimes the vagaries that art represents. And great art sometimes needs the structure, the deliberation that science works on. So let's not see both things as being separate. In fact, if there's a quote that I'd like to share with you on the need for storytelling, storytelling, as shown in this quote, talks about how we are sometimes so addicted to stories that sometimes even at night, we are telling ourselves stories. Do you remember what you dreamt last night? Was it a sweet dream or was it a nightmare? From the looks of a couple of you, it seems like, you probably had nightmares and that's why, you're looking a bit slightly frightened. Whichever the case, the commonality is we all weave and we sort of construct stories all the time. Now, let me take you to a time when I was in South Korea where a 6-year-old taught me the power of stories and how stories have changed his entire life. Well, what you see here is a classic kindergarten scene. And about 8 years ago, I was doing a student exchange at an all-women's university. Right? All of you look shocked and amazed, but let me tell you, it is a true story. Classically, I have 2 responses. When I tell all the gentlemen that, hey, I'm going to an all-women's university for exchange, all the guys will say, wow. until I tell them what's going to happen next. Well, I'm going there with my girlfriend. And then they say, oh. So what happens was that, no, that was not the story, by the way. I was doing classes over at this university, and after class, I would volunteer my time and energy because I believe that, hey, that's the way to grow and to give back. So on the JD of my volunteer job was actually to teach English. But my actual JD on the ground was to take care of children, as you can see all of them here. One child particularly stood out to me. And you may ask why. Because as we all know, all classes, there will be the good ones, the rowdy ones, the cranky ones, the oddballs, right? But there was this boy, and the circle in red, his name is Troy. He particularly gave me a lot of challenge and a lot of issues. When the first time I met him, I noticed he was hyperactive. He couldn't sit still, he was moving around, and he was like, sort of like teasing and disturbing a lot of kids. So I went to the teacher in charge and I said, hey, what's wrong with Troy? And said, Ben, if you think Troy is having a bit of issues now, you should see him, or should have seen him 2 years ago. And then later I realized, on the first day when Troy went to the kindergarten, he actually got into huge trouble. Because of a slight disagreement, he started to bite the arm of another boy, and he bit it so hard that ambulance had to be called in. And you could imagine that the teacher was so shocked when the blood was flowing from the other boy. And from the surface, a lot of people thought that Troy was a troublemaker. It was only until the teacher asked, what was the story behind Troy? And then later when she recounted to me, she told me that Troy wasn't this boy all this while. What happened was that 2 years ago, before he went into kindergarten, he noticed that his beloved grandma, the lady that brought him up from young, all the way to 4 or 5 years old, was caught in a hit and run accident. So can you imagine a boy, 4 to 5 years old, seeing his beloved grandma getting knocked out by a car and having no one to help? That was the state of Troy that was left after his grandma's incident. And since then, Troy was angry, he was angsty, and he hated this world. And that was the state whereby he went to kindergarten, and that was the state whereby he got another boy into accident. But why am I telling you all this, right? Hang on a minute, we're going to the crux now. His parents, knowing that Troy would be hugely impacted, decided to send Troy for art therapy lessons. And during the art therapy lessons, that's one thing you want to know. You do not want to be an art therapist when Troy was there. Troy was throwing paper, was creating a lot of ruckus, and even the art therapist could not take it. But slowly and surely, the therapist made it. On the third session, the therapist had a breakthrough moment. She asked Troy to first draw out the favorite food. And if you've been to Korea, you have this kimbap, which looks like sushi, and that was Troy's favorite food. The second attempt was to draw out his favorite toy, and Troy drew out his favorite toy. And the last question, or the last prompt, was to draw out Troy's favorite person. And as you can imagine, when Troy drew out his grandma, his tears all went out, right? And that was the most cathartic moment for Troy, because that was the time whereby he found a release, a solace through visual storytelling. So what happened when he went to kindergarten, the drawing part really helped him a lot. So the teacher said, hey, why don't you draw more? Why don't you draw more? So at the start, his drawing was terrible, right? He drew an apple that looked like an orange. He drew a pizza that looks like a burger. He drew an elephant that looks like a tiger. If you can name it, you can imagine it. That was how bad it was. But you know what worked for Troy? He didn't care. He didn't bother. Because deep down inside, he was so clear that storytelling was just a way to let things out. So why do I tell you the story of Troy? It's because I think the lesson here from Troy is that we do not need incidents or accidents like Troy to have the kind of courage. But it is because of people like Troy that knows that we live in a world of judgment. That like it or not, people will judge us. People will judge us for our work, our words, and our deeds. But if only we have the courage to use visual storytelling or storytelling as a tool. And that was the first lesson that this boy taught me. Well, many years back, I started to take on more corporate clients. And one of the clients was actually a lead scientist in a sort of up-and-coming research agency in Singapore where I work in. And the first time he met me and he said, Ben, I want you to have more influence in my presentations. I said, great, let's get started. I got him up, did his presentation, and if you can visualize this, for 20 minutes he had 87 slides. It was chock full of information, bullet points. He even was bored of his content, much less me. I couldn't even get through 27 of that. So I told him, so why don't you just talk to me conversationally? It turns out he was a humorous person. He loves to share all of this. So I say, Doctor, why don't you tell a story and make it a bit more humorous and engaging? What was his retort to me? Ben, I am no storyteller and I am not a stand-up comedian. I am a PhD. He said it with utmost confidence. Now I told him, what about if I tell you there's a PhD out there who's doing exactly what you should be doing that you're not doing right now? So what you see on the screen is actually a gentleman by the name of Joe Wong. Joe Wong is ethnically Korean, grew up in China, and went to the States to do his master's program. And when I first saw Joe's stand-up comics or comedy content, I was totally blown away because he had a scientific background where, everything was structured, black and white, straight to the point. But how did he come to the performance stage where everything was vagary, everything was gray, everything was, impromptu and spontaneous? So I decided to grab hold of him when he was in Singapore, and as you can imagine, that was a prize $1 million moment. He told me when he first came to United States, his English standard was really, really low, and the classmate standards were really high. So in the class full where he was doing his PhD program, the professor would then ask questions, as most professors would. He had the answer, whereas none of the class had. But he didn't have the confidence to say it out. So what he did, he asked Steve, his classmate, to answer the question. And when Steve answered the question with the inputs and answer from Joe, the professor praised him openly, and Steve in that point of view. So that was the moment whereby Joe realized that, hey, there are a lot of things inside me that if I don't find a channel, a way, a language to express it out, I will never do that. So story has that 8 years later, he finally had this breakthrough moment as a stand-up comedian. He went on the Oprah Winfrey Show, on the Colbert Show, as you've seen just now, and today he does stand-up comedy for a living. So what did I tell to this PhD client of mine? I told him that it is not about whether you have a PhD or not. It's most importantly that in spite of your huge, immense wealth of knowledge, can you be open to using a new way to connect with your audience? And to Joe, the reason why he does stand-up comedy to him is that it is his way to make sense of the world around. It is his way to connect with people. It is his way to tell stories of how he's been racially marginalized, racial slurs, and being looked down on as an Asian growing up or working in the United States. So as I wrap up my entire speech, I leave you with one final quote. And I love to use this quote because I believe that sometimes writing your stories is not just for yourself. In fact, writing your stories as a stand professional is not just about showing off or showcasing. But the whole purpose and the tenet behind why we tell stories is not just to serve us, but to serve the people that we like to serve. And when you tell great stories right, that's when the magic happens. That's when the people that you want to connect with, they see and discover themselves in your story. The question is, what is your story? How would you write your story? And how does your story look like when it's being told? And of course, I have to end with how I start. Science, technology, engineering, and math. What do they have to do with storytelling? Everything. Thank you so much, and I wish you a great day ahead.